Now, this wasn't just a procedural vote. It's a clear rejection of the idea that one person can unilaterally send American sons and daughters into harm's way without Congress, without debate. The yeas are 52, the nays are 47. The motion is agreed to. Joint resolution will be placed on the calendar. The joint resolution will be placed on the calendar. Vote. The final vote was 232 to 197 in favor of impeachment and took place in what a week ago was a crime scene. That's when a pro-Trump mob occupied Congress in an effort to overturn the presidential election, leading to 5 deaths. Democrats argued this was the shattering of Trump's glass house of lies built upon 4 years of racist fear-mongering. Every one of us in this room right now could have died. As Senator Lindsey Graham said, the arguments came down to what's more dangerous: impeach Donald Trump again and risk further dividing the country, or allow him to remain in office. Even if, it's just for a few days, he is capable of starting a civil war, he must be impeached. He must be stopped now. Something extraordinary happened inside the U.S. Senate, and Donald Trump did not see it coming. In a chamber designed for order, tradition, and quiet procedure, senators suddenly stood up, turned their backs, and walked out. No speeches, no warnings, just an unmistakable act of defiance that instantly stunned Capitol Hill. Staffers froze, cameras scrambled, leadership was left staring at half. Empty seats, trying to understand what had just unfolded in real time. And somewhere else watching the feed, Donald Trump realized he had lost control of the room. This was not a protest planned weeks in advance. This was not symbolic theater. This was a live rupture inside the Senate, unfolding without coordination from party leaders, without clearance from leadership officers, and without a strategy Trump could counter in the moment. The walkout wasn't loud, but that made it more powerful. Silence can be devastating in Washington. According to insiders, Trump was blindsided. Advisors expected debate, procedural delays, maybe sharp rhetoric. What they did not anticipate was a unified physical rejection. Senators refusing to legitimize what was happening simply by staying in their seats. In Washington, walking out is not just a gesture. It is a statement that something has crossed a line. Within minutes, phones started ringing across the Capitol. Staffers rushed between offices. Leadership teams scrambled to contain a narrative that was already slipping out of their hands. Social media lit up. News alerts fired off, and Trump's inner circle began asking the same question everyone else was asking. How did this happen without warning? This moment matters because it breaks a rule that usually holds firm. Senators argue, posture, and negotiate, but they rarely abandon the floor together. When they do, it signals more than disagreement. It signals a breakdown of authority. And for Trump, authority is everything. What followed next was not just political fallout. It was panic, damage control, and a realization that the Senate had just sent a message Trump could not spin away. The walkout was only the beginning. The Senate did not erupt without a reason. What pushed lawmakers to their feet had been building quietly for days, hidden behind closed doors, procedural language, and last-minute pressure that finally crossed a line. The session was supposed to be routine. On the schedule was a vote tied to Trump-backed legislative demands, framed publicly as necessary, urgent, and non-negotiable. Leadership expected resistance, debate, maybe a drawn-out procedural fight. What they did not expect was a coordinated refusal to participate at all. According to multiple Capitol aides, the breaking point came when senators were informed that the measure would be forced through without meaningful debate, amendments, or transparency. Several lawmakers, including members of Trump's own party, felt they were being ordered to rubber-stamp decisions they had not fully reviewed. That may sound technical, but inside the Senate, it is a red line. One senior aide described the atmosphere as controlled pressure turning into quiet fury. Senators exchanged looks, notes were passed, phones buzzed under desks. The sense in the room was not confusion. It was resolve. Staying seated would signal compliance. Walking out would signal resistance. What made this moment explosive was that it wasn't driven by Democrats alone. Sources say a small but critical group of Republicans were among the first to stand. That shattered the illusion of party unity Trump depends on. Once a few senators moved, others followed. Momentum replaced hesitation. Leadership tried to intervene. Staffers whispered. Gavel taps echoed awkwardly through the chamber. But it was too late. The message had already been delivered in the most unmistakable way possible. From Trump's perspective, this was a nightmare scenario. There was no opponent to attack, no speech to interrupt, no sound bite to hijack. A walkout leaves nothing to argue with. It leaves absence. And absence speaks volumes. Within minutes, word reached Trump's team. According to insiders, disbelief quickly turned to anger. This had not been approved. This had not been negotiated. And worst of all, it happened live. The walkout wasn't about a single bill. It was about power, process, and whether senators were willing to keep playing along. And in that moment, they chose to leave the room. Donald Trump did not hear about the Senate walkout through a briefing memo or a carefully worded call from leadership. He saw it unfold in real time. According to people familiar with the situation, Trump was watching. Coverage expecting the usual back and forth, a predictable cycle of debate and partisan talking points. Instead, the camera cut to senators standing up, collecting papers, and exiting the chamber one by one. At first it looked like confusion. Then it became impossible to ignore. Trump's reaction was immediate. Advisers say he repeatedly asked whether this was planned, whether leadership had approved it, and why no one had warned him. There were no answers because there had been no warning. That was the shock. Inside Trump's inner circle, panic set in fast. A walkout removes the ability to dominate the narrative. There is no speech to counter, no microphone to seize, no opponent standing still long enough to attack. The image speaks for itself. Empty seats, abandoned desks, a Senate refusing to participate. Trump reportedly demanded updates every few minutes. Who walked out? How many? Which party? Who could be pressured to return? Calls were placed to allies on Capitol Hill, but the response was unsettling. Lawmakers were not picking up, or they were offering carefully vague answers. No one wanted to be the one promising control they no longer had. What made this moment especially dangerous for Trump was the timing. This was happening live during a period when his authority was already under strain. A walkout at any time would be damaging. A walkout now suggested something deeper. A loss of discipline, a breakdown of coordination, a crack in the system that usually protects him. Media coverage amplified the chaos. Anchors stopped mid-sentence to acknowledge what they were seeing. Commentators struggled to explain it because Senate walkouts are rare and risky. The fact that senators were willing to do this without a prepared narrative suggested urgency, not strategy. Trump understood the signal immediately, even if he refused to acknowledge it publicly. This was not about policy details anymore. This was about whether he could still command loyalty inside the institution that had so often bent around him. And for the first time in a long time, the Senate had moved without asking his permission. While Trump fumed behind the scenes, chaos rippled through Capitol leadership offices. The walkout had created a problem no one had prepared for, not because it violated rules, but because it exposed how fragile control had become. Senate leaders immediately went into damage control mode. Staffers rushed between offices, phones pressed to their ears trying to determine who had participated and whether the walkout could be framed as something less than it was. Was it procedural? Was it temporary? Would they come back? No one had clear answers, and that uncertainty only made the situation worse. Leadership aides privately admitted that the walkout caught them completely off guard. There had been no advanced warning, no negotiation window, no time to build a counter-narrative. In Washington, surprise is dangerous, and this was a clean one. Senators had acted independently, bypassing the normal pressure channels that leadership in the White House usually rely on behind closed doors. Tempers flared. Some leaders were furious at the senators who walked out, accusing them of weakening the party at a critical moment. Others were quietly sympathetic, acknowledging that the process had been pushed too far and that ignoring concerns had consequences. The split was immediate and visible. Meanwhile, the Senate floor sat in an awkward limbo. Proceedings stalled. Cameras lingered on empty rows. Every second that passed reinforced the image of a chamber unable to function as expected. The longer it went on, the harder it became to pretend this was minor. Outside the chamber, reporters swarmed. Questions piled up. Was this a protest against Trump? Was it about the bill? Was leadership losing control? Spokespeople struggled to offer consistent answers because there was no unified explanation. Each vague response only fueled speculation. For Trump, this was the worst possible outcome. A political crisis he could not directly touch, managed by leaders who were themselves unsure how to respond. Every attempt to downplay the walkout risked making it look more significant. Every attempt to attack it risked confirming that it mattered. By the end of Section 4, one thing was clear. The Senate walkout was no longer a moment. It was a problem. And no one in Washington seemed certain how to put the pieces back together. By the time senators began returning to their offices, the damage was already done. What had been quietly whispered for months was now visible to everyone watching. The Senate was no longer moving as a single disciplined body, and Trump's influence over it was no longer guaranteed. Insiders describe a sharp divide forming almost immediately. One group believed the walkout had gone too far and feared retaliation from Trump and his base. Another group felt a sense of relief, as if a pressure valve had finally been released. Staying silent had become riskier than standing up. For Trump, this was the real threat, not opposition from Democrats, but hesitation from within his own orbit. Loyalty had always been enforced through fear of consequences. The walkout showed that some senators were willing to absorb that risk. Behind closed doors, conversation shifted. Instead of asking how to push Trump's agenda, senators began asking how much longer they could afford to be tied to it. The walkout had turned abstract concern into a shared experience. Once that happens, it is hard to reverse. Trump's response followed a familiar pattern. Anger first, blame second, escalation third. Within hours, allies were signaling that statements were coming, endorsements were being reconsidered, and political consequences were on the table. Sources say Trump demanded a list of names who walked out, who hesitated, who stayed seated but did not intervene. In Trump's world, neutrality is betrayal. Silence is disloyalty. Privately, advisers urged restraint. Public retaliation could deepen the fracture and validate the walkout's message. Trump reportedly rejected that advice. From his perspective, allowing defiance to go unanswered was more dangerous than overreacting. The problem was leverage. Threats only work if people still believe you control the outcome. The walkout suggested that belief was weakening. As coverage intensified, the narrative shifted. This was no longer framed as a procedural dispute. Analysts began calling it a warning shot. Commentators pointed out that senators are trained to endure pressure. They vote against their own preferences. They absorb backlash. They rarely abandon the chamber itself. When they do, it signals that normal channels have failed. Clips of empty seats played on a loop. Pundits asked the question, Trump hates most. If senators are willing to walk out now, what happens when the stakes get higher? The walkout became a symbol, not of rebellion, but of exhaustion. Beyond Trump, the walkout exposed something deeper. Congress is built on norms, not force. When those norms break, the system struggles to function. Lawmakers rely on the process to protect them. When the process is bypassed, walking out becomes one of the few tools left. That reality unsettled even those who oppose the protest. If walkouts become normalized, governance slows, trust erodes, and power shifts away from institutions toward spectacle. That possibility alarmed leadership on both sides of the aisle. Strategists quickly began gaming out the consequences. Primary challenges, retirements, quiet exits from leadership roles. The walkout introduced uncertainty into calculations that once felt predictable. Some senators began reassessing timelines. Others began distancing themselves rhetorically, softening language, emphasizing independence. These are early signs, but in politics, early signs matter. Trump thrives on certainty. The walkout injected doubt. The Senate walkout was not loud. It was not violent. It did not involve shouting or speeches. That is exactly why it was powerful. It showed that authority can be challenged without confrontation, that refusal can speak louder than an argument, and that control, once questioned, is hard to reassert. Trump was caught off guard because this was not his battlefield. There was nothing to attack, nothing to dominate, nothing to spin away, just absence. And sometimes absence is the most dangerous message of